Great, thanks, Megan. So as Megan mentioned, my name is Neil. I'm a representative from Sprintax, and I'm joined by my colleague Elvira.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for joining.
So before we kick off, we might just look at the housekeeping piece. This webinar will be recorded, and it will be made available to everybody after the session. So feel free to go on to the Northeastern website, and it'll be there. You'll also notice that everybody is muted at the moment, but you'll see that there is a question box. So feel free to use that chat box to ask any questions that you might have at the end. Hopefully we'll cover everything throughout the presentation, but there might be one or two questions that we might have missed. Next up is the disclaimer. So because we're talking about tax, we always start with the disclaimer. And we always say that tax is kind of like your own DNA, in that you could be sitting beside somebody that's from the same home country, that has the same on-campus job, but one slight difference in your tax in your circumstances might completely change your tax liability. So for that reason, we always say to ignore everybody else when you're doing your non-resident tax return and only focus on your own information, your own income documents, and your own days of presence in the US. And by doing that, and by going onto the Sprintax website and filling out the questionnaire, we can ensure that you then have a 100% correct tax return. So for that reason, you're going to hear me use the word generally and typically about 100 times over the presentation, because I'm going to give you a very broad overview of non-resident tax, but it's not until you go into the Sprintax software that you'll really see what applies to you. So what are we going to focus on? So first, we're going to have a look at defining residency for tax purposes. We're going to have a look at who must file a 2020 US tax return. We'll look at what tax forms should be received, forms you need to complete and send to the IRS, what happens if you don't have any income, what is a FICA return, and then we'll look at state returns and filing incorrectly, and then the actual Sprintax software. So we'll first look at the important dates for 2020. So I think everyone probably agrees that the US tax system is a bit of a nightmare. But the only thing straightforward about it is it runs the same as the calendar year. So that means that everything we focus on today for your 2020 tax return relates to any income that you've received from the 1st of January 2020 until the 31st of December 2020. So when it comes to your tax return and when it comes to looking at your income documents, we only need to focus on that period. Everything outside of that, we can kind of forget about when we're doing our 2020 return. The next important date then that everybody should be aware of is the actual filing deadline. And this year, that deadline is Thursday, April the 15th, 2021. So do make sure you get all of your documents in for that date. Some of your documents will actually need to be physically mailed to the IRS. So it's really important that you do get them prepared and sent as soon as possible. So as soon as you get your income documents, it's probably a good stage to tick that box and get your tax return out of the way. So let's look at what determines residency for tax purposes. And without a doubt, this is definitely the #1 area that we get questions on every single year. And it's slightly confusing because I imagine most people on this call are a non-resident for immigration purposes. But you can also be a resident for tax purposes while also being a non-resident for immigration purposes. So it's important to know that the two are not linked in any way whatsoever. And when it comes to taxes, it's all based on the number of days you've actually been present in the US. So there's a couple of rules around that we'll break down. And a lot of these rules are really based on the visa that you're on. So first off, let's look at anyone that's on a student visa, that's J1 or F1. So if you're on a J1 or an F1 student visa, the rule that the IRS put on you to decide whether you're a resident or a non-resident is that you have typically your first 5 calendar years in the US are exempt. So that means for your first 5 calendar years on J1 or F1 visa status, you'll be considered a non-resident for tax purposes. So after you go past that 5-year period then, so you're on year 6, the IRS will then look at what's known as the substantial presence test. And essentially it's a maths equation. They'll look at your last 3 years that you were in the US and they'll see if it equates to 183 days. And if your days of presence equate to 183 days, you'll be then considered a resident for tax purposes. Now, if we have any J researchers or scholars or professors, the rule is slightly different in that instead of that 5-year period that the J1 and F1 student visas get, you actually get 2 out of the last 6 calendar years where you're considered a non-resident for tax purposes. So if you've been here for 2 years and then you move into your 3rd year on any of those visas, again, the IRS will move to the substantial presence test. And they'll look at your last 3 years, and if the total days of presence equate to 183 days, again, you'll be considered a resident for tax purposes. Now, this sounds very complicated, but the good news is that's kind of what the Sprintax software is there for. So every question that we get about residency and whether a student is a resident versus non-resident, we kind of always have the same response, and it's that you'll need to go into step 1 of Sprintax. And on step 1 of Sprintax, we'll ask you for all of your entry and exit dates. And by giving us that information, the software will actually tell you if you're a resident or a non-resident. And the software will look at your days of presence, it'll look at your visa type, and then do that equation for you. So if you're not sure, I would say start with that. Here's a useful summary that everybody can have a look at. It breaks down each visa type and then whether the 5-year rule or the 2-year rule applies. So you'll see the F1 and the J1 visas are 5 years, and then kind of most of the other J1 visas are 2 years. So in terms of kind of the days that actually count towards the substantial presence test, we have a couple of examples here. So we have a family trip to Disneyland in the 1980s. We have 2 years in a US high school in the 2000s. We have a shopping trip to New York in the 1990s. And you're probably wondering, well, why are all these relevant? That was a long time ago. The answer is that when you're on the Sprintax website, you do need to enter all of your entry and exit dates. All trips must be taken into account, and they may all be relevant. So we do ask you for all of your entry and exit dates. So who actually has a filing requirement then for 2020? So the first point is that everybody must complete something. As a non-resident, and that something is Form 8843. That's kind of the minimum form that every non-resident is expected to complete. And that is irrespective of income. So if you had no income whatsoever, you still need to file Form 8843, or days of presence. So that means if you were in the US in 2020 for just 1 day, that's the qualifying factor, just 1 day, then you'll also need to submit Form 8843. So it applies to everybody. Next up then, if you received any taxable earnings or income over $0 in 2020, you'll then trigger a federal filing requirement. So for instance, if you had an on-campus job, again, if you earned $1 there, or obviously you're going to earn more than that, but $1 is the threshold, you'll then trigger a federal filing requirement. Next up, if you received a taxable stipend or a grant or an allowance, again, all of that will go towards your federal filing requirement. And again, you'll need to submit Form 1040-NR for your federal tax return. And Form 1040-NR is the form that will apply to every non-resident that has triggered a federal filing requirement. For anybody that would have done tax returns in the past, they may have been issued a 1040-NR-EZ. But just for those guys that might be confused whether you're getting a different form this year, the 1040-NR-EZ has been discontinued. So every non-resident federal return is now covered under the one document. But I suppose the big point from this slide is that everybody needs to do something. If you were here for any amount of days, the minimum is Form 8843. And Form 8843 is a fairly straightforward form. If you're using Sprintax, again, it should take you about 10 to 15 minutes to prepare just this form. Obviously, if you have a federal or a state, it'll take a little bit longer, probably 25 to 30 minutes overall. But if it's just Form 8843, it's pretty straightforward. The form asks for some basic information like your first name, your last name, your address, the number of days you've been present in the US, and then some other basic visa information. So at this stage, we know that everybody needs to do Form 8843. We know that if you've earned over $0, you'll trigger a federal filing requirement, but there's also state filing requirements. So depending on what state you live in, again, you could be considered a resident, part-year resident, and non-resident within each state. And again, that's all based on the number of days you were present in each state. So looking at the rules for Massachusetts, again, as we mentioned, you can be a non-resident. And really, you can be a non-resident in Massachusetts if you weren't a resident of Massachusetts, but earned MA income at some stage. You can be a part-year resident if you are if you moved into or moved out of Massachusetts during the taxable year. In that case, they'll consider you part-year resident. And you'll be considered a full-time Massachusetts resident if you maintain a permanent place of abode in Massachusetts and during the year spent more than 183 days in the state. So I imagine most people will be a resident because that's a fairly easy threshold to reach. So do you need to file a Massachusetts state return? So you need to file a Massachusetts state return if you are a resident in Massachusetts and earned over $8,000 in MA income. And $8,000 is generally the threshold that you'll see as being the most common. It's important to note that if you earned under the $8,000 threshold, but Massachusetts state tax was withheld, you might still want to do a tax return because that means you'll get all of that tax back. But again, Sprintax will do the work for you. We'll tell you if you've met the different thresholds, whether you're a resident versus non-resident in each state that you've lived in, and then we'll tell you if you owe the IRS money or if you're due a refund back. So how does the IRS define income then? So I think everybody will be aware that employment, income, salaries, and wages are all considered income by the IRS. But your scholarship can also be considered income. So if you have a scholarship that covers tuition, but also it covers areas outside of tuition, then that scholarship is considered taxable. So I'll give an example. If somebody comes to Northeastern and they have a scholarship that covers areas outside of tuition, like room and board, it might cover some expenses, might be a stipend. Again, because that scholarship covered areas outside of tuition, it's taxable, and the student should expect to receive an income document for that scholarship. Essentially, the IRS look at it the same as if it was on-campus income or if it was wages or salary. Next up then is unearned income. So again, this is kind of trending at the moment. Robinhood is certainly making the headlines, and we're certainly getting lots of questions about it. So if you have investment income and you have invested in Robinhood or any other platform and you've sold those investments, again, you should expect to receive an income document for that. And again, you will use that towards your non-resident tax return. Other income then that's a bit more obscure, gambling winnings. If you won anything at all, it could be $5, could be $500. Again, all of that is considered US income, and that needs to be accounted for on your non-resident tax return. We have focus group here as an example. So if you took part in a focus group and you were given a gift card for your services, you need to claim that gift card and actually pay tax on that gift card. Rental income over 14 nights. So the threshold is 14 nights. So if you have an Airbnb or a room that you have on Airbnb and you have rented that out for more than 14 nights, you should expect to receive an income document from Airbnb with information on that rental. And then finally, we have selling art or design work. Again, anything that you've earned income in the US will be taxable. So what income then does not trigger a filing requirement? And it's quite limited, as you can expect. The first is, and we've touched on this, a scholarship for tuition or tuition-related expenses. So again, I mentioned that taxable scholarship a while ago. That scholarship that covers areas outside of tuition, like room and board. But if your scholarship just covers tuition, then it's not considered taxable and you won't receive an income document for it. If you received your scholarship from outside the US, I'll use an example. So you've probably guessed from my accent, I'm from Ireland. So if I received a scholarship from, let's say, the Arts Council of Ireland to come and study in the US, because that scholarship was issued from outside of the US, it's not considered taxable here. So you don't need to issue that on your US non-resident tax return. Money transferred from parents or relatives overseas then, again, because your parents or your relatives are probably paying tax on that back in your home country, you are exempt from paying tax on that in the US. So again, you don't need to include that on your non-resident tax return. Again, a very similar point, income earned in your home country. So again, Massachusetts is expensive. In a lot of cases, you'll have a student save up money back in their home country and bring that over with them when they come to study here in the US. Because you earned that back in your home country, again, you can bring over as much as you want without it triggering a filing requirement here in the US. The final point then is interest on a regular savings and checking account. Generally, the IRS don't need you to claim that on your non-resident tax return. So you'll probably see there's a general trend here that any income that was not earned within the US as a non-resident is not taxable. Any income that was earned within the US is taxable. And that's only as a non-resident. The minute you become a resident, everything becomes taxable, no matter where it's earned. So next up, let's look at the tax documents then that you should expect to receive or should at least know about. The first is a W-2, and a W-2 is the most common document, and it covers everything from wages, salary, or compensation, typically from a direct employer. And the important point to note about the W-2 is that if you've had multiple employers throughout the year, you should expect to receive multiple W-2s. Next up then is the 1042-S document. And the 1042-S document generally covers that taxable stipend or grant or scholarship that I mentioned a while ago. So again, if you have a scholarship that covers areas outside of tuition, this is where that scholarship will be reported to you. Royalty payments, we have prizes and awards or miscellaneous foreign payments. Again, if any of that was issued to you, generally it's issued on a 1042-S. And the last point on the 1042-S is income covered under a tax treaty. So generally any income that's covered under a tax treaty will always be reported on a 1042-S. And again, you'll include that on your non-resident tax return just to let the IRS know that you've used this tax treaty. So the final document then is the 1099 series, and there's a whole host of different 1099 documents which kind of cover everything else that the first two documents don't cover. So that could be rental income. I mentioned the Airbnb over 14 nights. This is a document you'll get. I mentioned Robinhood. This is a document you'll get from Robinhood. Any commissions, or if you worked as an independent contractor, will all be issued on a 1099 document. So next up then, let's look at the rules around non-resident spouse and dependents. So first of all, as a non-resident, you can never file jointly. You always have to file separately from your spouse. The other rule is that the same rules that apply to you apply to your spouse and dependents. So that means that regardless of the number of days that they've spent in the US, if they were here for more than 1 day, they'll need to do Form 8843. If they've earned any income over $0, they'll trigger a federal filing requirement. And if they, depending on the state they live in, if they meet the state filing thresholds, they'll also trigger a state filing requirement. So the same rules that apply to you apply to them. You just need to file separately at all times. The other interesting rule about dependents is regardless of what age your dependent is, they still need, or you still need to file on their behalf Form 8843. So that applies to children, babies, anyone that's a non-resident needs to file Form 8843. So next up then, we'll look at FICA taxes. So for anyone that doesn't know what FICA is a tax whereby if you're 65 years of age and you're retired in the US and you need assistance paying your medical bills, FICA will assist you with that. But when the IRS look at non-residents, they think, well, first off, you're not going to be here at the age of 65 and retired. So for that reason, generally, if you're on a J1 or an F1 visa, you are exempt from paying FICA taxes. And that also applies to anyone on OPT. Now that's fine, that's fine in theory, but in practice, it doesn't always work out that way. In that in a lot of cases, you'll have a student that goes on OPT, they'll go to a big company with 1,000 employees, and you might be just one of 10 non-residents. And generally that means that the payroll department will treat you the same as everybody else, which means that FICA will be incorrectly withheld from your wages. In that case, you'll need to first off go directly to the employer and request that they refund that FICA tax back. In most cases, they will not be able to. If that is the case, you can then apply for a FICA refund back via Sprintax. So again, once you go through the software, we'll tell you if you're due a FICA refund back. And we'll also tell you the steps to take to try and get that refund back. But a good exercise for everybody to follow is to take out their W-2 now and have a look at the section that says FICA or ITIN or Medicare. And if there's any amount at all withheld from any of those boxes, and you're a J1 or an F1 visa holder, there's a good chance you'll get all of that back. So next up then is the ITIN, or the Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. So an ITIN is a tax number that applies to somebody that has triggered a filing requirement here in the US, but is not eligible to work in the US. So who might that be? So again, let's go back to that taxable scholarship I mentioned a while ago. So if you have somebody that came to the US, they are not eligible to work, which means they're not eligible to apply for a social security number, but their scholarship covers areas outside of tuition. So it covers room and board or something else. In that case, that student will trigger a federal and possibly a state filing requirement. And in that case, they'll need to apply for an ITIN for their federal forms and their state forms. If you're eligible for a social security number, you'll never need an ITIN. It's one or the other, and the social security number always trumps the ITIN number. Again, if you go through the Sprintax software and we determine that you'll need an ITIN, we will prepare Form W7 for you, and then we'll give you instructions on what to do next with that document. Essentially, you'll need to go to a certified acceptance agent and get your passport certified, basically to say that the person on this form is indeed the person that I'm looking at, that's within this passport. So another really important form is Form 1098T. And 1098T is an educational tax credit that applies only to residents. In some cases, non-residents will be issued this document in error by their school, but unfortunately you cannot use it on your non-resident tax return. Sprintax actually won't ask you about it, so you might be wondering why that is. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that it's the #1 form of misfiling every year, that students will put this towards their tax return, and they'll get an extra tax credit that they're not entitled to, and that ultimately leads to, could lead to the IRS auditing their return. It could lead to fines or penalties. So just be very careful. If you have received this document, you can put it away for your own records, but you will not need it for your non-resident tax return. So next up then are forms 1095 A, B, and C series. And again, these documents won't be applicable to you. So if you've received any of these documents, it relates to how you received your healthcare, but you cannot use them towards your non-resident tax return. So Sprintax again will not ask you about them. So timelines for a refund. This is kind of a funny slide in that there was so much delays last year. We don't know what to expect this year. So typically, if I was doing this presentation a year or 2 years ago, I'd say your federal refund will normally take 6 weeks, but the IRS will give themselves up to 6 months. Last year, some returns took up to 8 months because of COVID and because there was nobody in the IRS office. We don't expect that the same level of delays will be there this year, but we'd hope, and we'd probably say maybe give them 2 to 3 months to get that refund processed for you. You can always check on irs.gov/refunds, and that will tell you if they've actually received your return and if they've processed it. So if you missed a year then, or you filed as a resident by mistake, and you're thinking, okay, I filed as a resident, but I should have filed as a non-resident, what do I do? Don't panic, there's always a way to correct that mistake. First off, I would say if you file as a resident, you'll need to, again, Sprintax can assist you, but you'll need to go and complete form 1040X, which is an amended US tax return. And you'll also need to prepare a correct tax return, so form 1040NR. And by completing both of those documents and sending them to the IRS, you're telling the IRS you made a mistake. You're showing the IRS the difference in tax withheld versus the refund you received, and you're correcting that error. If you have never filed at all and you want to catch up, I would say do so ASAP. You can catch up on the Sprintax website for the last 3 years, and the IRS will actually provide a refund up to the last 3 years if you are due one. But obviously, if you owe the IRS money and it goes back over 3 years, it's really important to catch up on that, because that could lead to fines or penalties over time. So I might hand over now to my colleague Elvira, who will take you through kind of the COVID impact payment piece, and she'll also show you the actual Sprintax software.
Great, thanks a million, Neil. So yeah, just to have a look at the COVID economic impact payments and how it has affected non-residents across the world and across the US. So we've seen the stimulus check make the headlines across the US and across the world, with people receiving that stimulus check in error. So we saw a lot of non-residents who filed incorrectly in the past and filed as a resident, and as a result then they've received the stimulus check in error. So they were wondering, why did they receive the stimulus check? Am I entitled to it? And if I'm not entitled to it, how do I go about returning that to the IRS? So in short, you won't qualify, or you won't be entitled for the stimulus payment if you're a non-resident alien for tax purposes. And also, in order to be eligible to receive and to keep the payment, you'd have to have been resident alien for 2020. So that's an important factor. Some individuals may have been resident for the 2019 tax year, but in 2020 they may have left the US, maybe as a result of the pandemic, and now don't meet the substantial presence test and are not resident for 2020, so they wouldn't be eligible for the payment. Now there are additional resources and additional information available on the IRS website that gives further information on eligibility criteria. But in short, if you're a non-resident alien for tax purposes and a non-resident alien for 2020, you won't be eligible for the economic impact payment. So we did see a second stimulus check passed then in December 2020, and the eligibility for this payment is similar to the last in that it's available for US citizens and resident aliens who are not eligible to be claimed as a dependent on somebody else's tax return. So this payment was $600 for individuals, $1,200 for married couples, and up to $600 for each qualifying child. But again, a really important factor here is that you won't qualify for the second stimulus check if you're a non-resident alien for tax purposes for 2020. So a common scenario that came to light then As a result of the stimulus check going out to non-residents across the US and around the world, is that non-residents who had filed incorrectly in the past as residents and received that stimulus check in error now needed to prepare an amended tax return and a correct non-resident tax return, so the 1040 NR. They also needed to make any necessary amended payment and also then to return that stimulus check. So if you filed incorrectly as a resident in the past and you've claimed the educational tax credit and maybe other credits that are available to residents but not to non-residents, if you've been overpaid tax by the IRS, then obviously that needs to go back. So any overpaid tax and that stimulus check would need to go back to the IRS. So just to have a look at the reality of the situation then, I suppose Sprintax in 2019 would have prepared about 330 amended tax returns. 2020 we prepared over 5,500 amended returns. So just goes to show the impact that it had. That stimulus check going out highlighted the fact that so many had filed incorrectly in the past and now needed to complete an amended return to set the record straight. So if you have received the stimulus check, if you filed an error in the past, you're not the only one, but do set the record straight. If you need to go ahead and get your return amended, that's something you definitely should do. So just looking at the implications then of not filing. And the one we've highlighted here and the one we'll always continue to emphasize is the impact that it could have on your future immigration status. So there may be some of you on today's webinar that are looking to stay in the US and looking to apply for a change of status in the future, for example. And it's very likely that you will be asked for evidence of tax compliance in your visa interview. So we'd hate to see tax being something that would prevent anyone from staying in the US. So with that said, it's so important that you are tax compliant and that your tax returns are up to date for every year that you've been in the US. Additionally then, if you owe the IRS money, there's a high chance that they will apply fees and penalties, and interest can accrue on that. But I suppose the final reason then, in a lot of cases, you could actually receive a refund back. So obviously it's a big incentive to go in and see what may be there. Obviously it's the last reason why you'd go ahead and submit your return. Obviously everybody has an obligation. If you're non-resident, you do need to do something, minimum being Form 8843, but in a lot of cases you'll actually be due a refund, and the only way you'll get that back is by submitting your tax return. So additionally then, we just wanted to highlight, I suppose, the importance of being careful about the options that are being recommended to you. So you may have friends or fellow students or scholars that have used TurboTax, and they may be residents for tax purposes. So it's okay for them to use TurboTax to prepare their resident tax return. But if you're a non-resident for tax purposes, you can't use TurboTax to prepare your tax return, as they only prepare resident returns. Now you'll even see on the TurboTax website, they do mention, that they can't support non-resident tax returns, and they'll actually guide you back towards Sprintax. So just to be really careful, and looking at the options that are available to you, be sure that you're not using a resident provider. Unfortunately, TurboTax, even though they say they can support non-resident tax returns, they don't stop you. If you go through, you can fill in your details and you can prepare an incorrect tax return. So really, really important just to be aware of that. So then moving on, just to have a look at using Sprintax and the process overview and what to expect when you sit down to prepare your tax returns. So Neil, I might just get you to move on to the next slide there if you don't mind. Perfect, great. So yeah, so the first thing you'll get is the email from the Office of Global Services. So they'll send you out an email with your link and your code in there. So your unique code is in that email. So what you do is copy your code and click on the link in the email, and that will bring you straight onto the Sprintax login page. So once you get to the Sprintax login page then, if you've used Sprintax in the past, you just click on the top right-hand corner, click Login, and you can log straight into your account. If it's your first time using Sprintax, then just click Create My Account, and we'll ask you for your first name, last name, email address, contact number, and to create a password. And you're straight in then to the questionnaire. So the first thing we'll always determine then is your residency for tax purposes. So step one, we'll always figure out if you're resident or non-resident for tax. So we'll ask you details of your, all the questions based around your residency, your visa details, entry and exit dates, and so on. And we'll use the substantial presence test then to work out if you're resident or non-resident for tax. If you're non-resident, you'll proceed on through Sprintax to prepare a non-resident return. But if we determine here that you're resident for tax purposes, we'll stop you. We won't let you go any further to complete an incorrect return. We'll let you know, okay, it looks like you're resident for tax purposes. You need to use a resident provider like TurboTax, our resident partner. But of course, only if you're resident for tax purposes. So if it's a case that you're unsure if you're resident or non-resident, just go into step one, fill in your details there, and we will work that out for you. So into the income details section then, we'll have asked you if you've received US source income, how many employers have you worked for, how many income documents have you got. For example, if you say, I worked for 2 employers, I've got 2 W-2s, we'll give you 2 blank W-2 documents here on Sprintax. Now, previously, you would have manually transferred the information from your physical document onto the blank document here on Sprintax. This season, with our new update, our OCR, or optical character recognition, now all you need to do is take a picture of your income document, upload that, and it'll pre-fill the document for you. So it'll save you that bit of time here. Also, you'll see on this screen that Got a Question has popped up. So Sprintax do offer 24/7 live chat assistance throughout filing season. So you'll see on the left-hand side of every screen as you go along, you've got Get Help. And in there, you've got your bank of frequently asked questions and also Ask Stacey, which is our live chat. But if you've been on any page for more than 30 seconds, that Got a Question box will pop up just to prompt you and see, do you need some assistance? So if you do have any questions along the way, please do use that live chat. It's really, really useful. State taxes then, Sprintax will assist with your state filing obligations as well. So, not only your federal, we can also prepare those state forms for you. So the system will recognize if you need to file a state return. And in some cases, you may have multiple state filing requirements depending on your circumstances. So we'll ask you for details like your entry date, exit date, the state you've lived in, the type of accommodation, and so on. And we'll work out then what your state filing obligations are. So on to the order breakdown then. In this example, you can see the student has a federal and a New York state filing requirement. And here is where you'll enter your access code. So in that email you received from the Office of Global Services, you've copied your code from there. You enter it in here into the yellow box and click Validate. And that will remove the cost of the federal or Form 8843 preparation fee. So that will remove that completely for you. If you have a state filing requirement and you want to proceed with that through Sprintax, you can pay for that then in the next screen yourself by card. So once you've done that then, you've gone through the hard bit, you've entered all your information, Sprintax will fill in those forms for you, so everything will be prepared and all you need to do then is download them and follow the instructions. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see we give you a cover page. So we'll tell you exactly what the next steps are. So an overview, so your tax summary, okay, you're due a refund on your federal or whatever the case may be. If it's a case you owe money to the IRS or the state authorities, that'll all be outlined here. What you need to do next then. So print the document, sign it on such a page, mail it with a copy of your W-2 or your 1042S, whatever the case may be, send it to this address. So we'll provide you with all of that information. And your documents then are all pre-filled. Now, the option to e-file is coming for federal tax returns, so hoping that's not too far off now, but it's going to make things that bit easier on the federal side for you. Important to note though, if you have a state tax, a state tax requirement, or if it's just Form 8843 you need to file. So if you haven't received income and it's just Form 8843, those will still need to be mailed. So it's just on the federal side that that option to e-file will be available. Then just to mention again, Sprintax can assist with amended returns. So if you are sitting there and you know, okay, I've submitted an incorrect tax return in the past, I've filed as a resident, I've received that educational tax credit, I've maybe received the stimulus check as well, you do need to submit an amended return and set the record straight. It is really important to be 100% up to date on your tax record. As I said earlier, it can impact your future visa applications and so on. So really important to be up to date there, but it is something that Sprintax can assist you with. So you just log in, click the year that you want to amend, click edit, and we'll guide you through the process there. So in terms of other supports then and the different options that are available to you. So we've got educational tax videos on YouTube. So you'll find a lot of your frequently asked questions covered in nice short videos on our YouTube channel. So definitely worth having a look on there. Blog content then for tax awareness. So our blog is always our first port of call. You know, whatever the tax season throws at us, if there's an extension to the filing deadline, you know, if there's a third stimulus check issued, anything that would be relevant to you, we'll always update the blog immediately, and we will share that with everyone. You know, so you will get notice of that. But do keep an eye on the blog and even have a look back through some of the previous blog posts. You will find those really, really useful. And then, as I mentioned, the 24/7 live chat assistance throughout filing season. So you can get the help you need from anywhere in the world, anytime, day or night, you know, so do use that rather than stopping what you're doing and maybe emailing the Office of Global Services with your questions. Use that live chat and we'll be able to assist you with your questions there and then. Also, we've launched recently our SPRINTAXTDS personal product. So this would assist anyone who's about to embark on OPT or CPT and needs assistance preparing their pre-employment tax forms. It ensures that you're taxed correctly on your income from the beginning. So it can generate any applicable tax forms for you, such as your W4, W8BEN, the 8233, and all you'd need to do then is to print it, sign it, and provide it to your employer. Now, it is completely separate to any end of year filing that you need to do. So this won't be relevant to everyone, but anyone that is about to embark on OPT or CPT and needs some assistance in preparing those pre-employment tax forms, SPRINTAXTDS Personal can assist you with that. So if it's a case you do need assistance there, it's just a case of going to the SPRINTAXTDS Personal webpage, just log in, create your account, and we'll guide you through the process there. So then just a quick look at the tax profile of the 215,000 international students and scholars that we helped last year. So of those students who used Sprintax last year, 70% of them were actually due a federal refund with an average there of $1,126. 59% received state refunds. Again, the average here of $463. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, if you're non-resident, everybody has some filing obligation, minimum being that Form 8843 if you haven't received any income. It is part of your visa obligations. It's something that you do need to do. But as you see, in a lot of cases, there are some nice refunds available too. So, you know, not only are you completing your filing obligations, but you may well also receive a nice refund through then as well. So that takes us to the end of today's session. Hopefully we've covered, you know, we've answered a lot of your questions throughout the way, and hopefully you found it useful, but we'll certainly have a look into the question box now and see what questions have been coming through along the way.
Great. So Oliver, I can jump in here. I can see there's a question from someone advising they have two W-2s, one with their university social security number and one with their correct social security number. And that document has name W2C. So they're saying that there's an incorrect social security number on one of their documents. So in that case, you will need to reach out to the person that issued the document and request that they amend it so that your correct social security number is showing. But that is an important step to take.
Great, and I see a question there, Neil, on state taxes. Do you know, if you've stayed in a different state and my employer, if I've stayed in one state and my employer's in a different state, am I eligible to pay state tax? So yeah, it's quite possible you may have a filing requirement in both states. It's hard to answer a question like that on a webinar like this because we need to ask you a lot of other questions, you know, to determine your circumstances and so on. But it is quite possible that you could have more than one state filing requirement. The best thing to do is to go in and fill in your details through the Sprintax questionnaire, and we will work that out for you in there.
Great. So someone is asking that they're saying that they haven't received the 1042S form yet. Should I wait to receive it to fill my taxes? And the answer is yes. So the 1042S form, the deadline for that is March the 15th. So I would say hold off until that date, until you've received that document, to go in and fill out your taxes, because otherwise you might have to make an amended tax return.
Great. And a question there, what if I don't remember my entry and exit dates from back in 2012? Okay, so you can actually use i94.gov for some of your more recent visits. I think that started in about 2015. But prior to that, what you'd need to do is go back through your old passports, or maybe check with family members. If it's a case, I know it's hard when you're going back a period of time like that, it's hard to have the exact dates. If you know that you've spent maybe 2 weeks in the US on family vacation or whatever in 2012, but you don't know the exact dates, be sure to put in some dates that account for that 2-week period. If it's not the exact dates, don't worry too much. Once you're accounting for that time period spent in the US, then that will be fine.
Okay, great. So someone has advised, I earned income in 2020, but have not received my income yet, as still waiting to receive my SSN card. Do I still qualify to submit taxes? I've not received this income. That's a funny one. So it sounds like you won't receive that income until 2021, which means it'll be included on your 2021 tax return and not your 2020 tax return. But I would definitely double check that with your employer, just to see if they will be issuing you with an income document. But it's very unlikely that they will be. I'd say at the end of 2021, you'll be issued with that income document, and that's when you'll see that wage included.
Great. Another question there. I've received the 1095B. Do I have to attach that while filing taxes? No, 1095B and C will not be needed. You don't need to provide information or a copy of that to us or to the IRS, you know, for your non-resident tax return. But if you received a 1095A, or you expect to receive a 1095A, wait until you've got that, and we can certainly assist you with your tax return offline. So we will need you to complete your account on Sprintax and email us with a copy of the 1095A, and we can prepare that for you offline. But 1095B and C you won't need for your non-resident tax return.
Okay, someone is asking, can they file Form 8843 online? Unfortunately not. The IRS do require that you do physically mail that document to them.
Perfect. Another one there. For someone who's landed in 2021, do we have to file Form 8843? No, if this is your first time in the US, so if you only arrived in 2020, you don't need to do anything for the 2020 tax year. You will need to file for 2021 when the time comes, which will be this time next year. But if you spent any time at all in the US in 2020, even if it was only a day or two, you would need to file something. Form 8843 if you haven't received any income, or a federal or state return possibly if you have received any. But if you haven't arrived until 2021, then you're okay for the moment. You don't need to do anything for 2020.
Okay, there's a question here saying, I had zero income in 2019 and did file tax in 2020 for that period. So basically they filed Form 8843. And then they go on to say, in 2020, I did earn and I'm filing taxes this year. Here's my question. Sorry, let's go back there. So on the Sprintax website, we ask, have you filed a US federal tax return before? And we asked, have you filed a state tax return before? And they say, what should I answer for this? So because you haven't filed a federal or state tax return before, you've only filed Form 8843, you can say no to that. It's only if you filed a federal or state tax return that you'd say yes to that question.
Perfect. Another one there, Neil. I'm a non-resident and received the 2 stimulus checks. How do I amend it? I haven't found any section relating to this issue on Sprintax. So yeah, we do have a blog post on the Sprintax website actually all around the stimulus check and what you need to do if you've received that in error, how you go about returning it, depending on how you received it, be it a bank transfer or a check you received or whatever. So we go through the different steps there. I'll get the link to that and I'll pop that into the chat there for you in a couple of seconds. So do have a look at that. It is really useful.
Someone has asked, does Sprintax work with staff on H1B? Yeah, we certainly do assist the H1B visa. Again, remember, Sprintax is for non-residents only. So we'll determine from step one if you're a resident versus non-resident. And if you're a H1B and still a non-resident for taxes, we can certainly assist.
Perfect. And see, a couple of questions just on catching up. If I haven't filed for previous years, you know, what do I need to do? So definitely catch up. You know, if it's a case you haven't filed for previous years, even if it's just the Form 8843, if you haven't received any income, you do need to have everything up to date for each year that you've been in the US. So do go back and catch up for any year that you may have missed.
Someone is asking, I landed in the US on the 25th of December 2019. So do I still need to file taxes for those 5 days? Yeah, so I'm presuming, and again, I'm making a presumption here that you haven't earned income in those 5 days, which means that you'll just need to do Form 8843.
Perfect. Now I've just put in the link there to that Sprintax blog post on the stimulus check. So do certainly have a look at that. There's lots of useful information in there.
Great, thanks, Elvira.
Nice.
So someone is asking, I had an internship in California last year. Do we need to file for 2 state taxes? So again, we'd have to look at how many days you were in each state, the type of accommodation, and a whole host of other questions. So once you go on to the Sprintax website, fill in all the information. We'll tell you if you've triggered 1 or 2 state filing requirements, depending on the states that you've lived in.
Perfect. Another one there then. I'm here at F1 status. I never went anywhere after coming here January 2020. Does that make me a resident for tax? So no, from the information you've provided there, if this, you know, if you first arrived in January 2020 in F1 status, you will be considered non-resident for your first 5 years in the US. Now, it depends on previous visits to the US and so on. So if you've had, you know, a number of visits previously, it could change things for you. The best thing to do is go into Sprintax and complete step 1 there. We'll work out your residency then for tax purposes based on the information you provide on your entry and exit dates and so on. So typically for the first 5 years in F1 status, you'll be considered non-resident, but you know, we do need to take into account previous visits. So do go in and complete step 1 there and we'll tell you for sure.
Great. Next question, does my spouse under F2 visa need to file a separate tax return? And the answer is yes. So you cannot file jointly. They do need to file separate documents, separate tax returns, and the same rules that apply to you apply to them, which means that they might just need to do Form 8843 if they have no income. But if they have income, they might need to do a federal and also a state.
Perfect. Just having a look through here to see what we haven't answered. Sorry, now loads of questions there. I know we've answered most of them, so just trying to find one we haven't gone through.
So loads of questions on resident versus non-resident, and again, just I suppose we'll probably try get a mix of questions. So we might, I suppose we've covered that a few times now, but just the answer to anyone that's asking about resident versus non-resident, you'll need to go to step 1 of Sprintax, and once you go to step 1, you can fill in your entry and exit dates, and then we'll tell you if you're a resident or a non-resident.
Great, and I see there's a couple of questions there on FICA as well, you know, just how do you claim it back using Sprintax? So I suppose as a non-resident, FICA tax, you're exempt from paying FICA tax. So residents would pay FICA tax all right. So in a lot of cases, you know, if you're working off campus, your employer may not know that and they could charge you FICA. So what you do is check your W-2. There is a section on there that says FICA, Medicare, Social Security, and if tax has been withheld there, and if you're on an F or a J visa, F1 or J1 visa, then you can claim that back. Now, we'd always say, firstly, ask the employer for a refund. That's the first port of call. But if they are, you know, not willing or unable to issue that refund, then Sprintax can certainly assist you with that. So we'll guide you through that process. You know, if you select that option on Sprintax, we'll guide you through that.
Okay, next question. If I am working 2 jobs for the same employer, example, teaching assistant and research assistant in my school, do I have to file 2 W-2 forms? That'll depend how that income is being reported. It'll more than likely be reported on 1 W-2. But I suppose it's up to you once you get that document to make sure that all of your income is reported on it. And once you know that, you can then enter that on the Sprintax website.
Okay, and I see a question there. The person who's asked it has actually left, but I think it's a question that you might be of interest to everybody. But had a question on 1098T. Is it for residents only? And if so, who exactly is resident for tax? So yeah, 1098T is applicable only to residents. So it's an educational tax credit of $1,000, but it's only applicable to residents. So you can't claim that as a non-resident. So a resident for tax purposes will be someone who's been in the US long enough to pass the substantial presence test and be considered resident for tax purposes. So depending on your visa type and the number of years that you're exempt from the substantial presence test, you know, it can be different for J or F visas or whatever. So, you know, if you're considered non-resident, you can't use the form 1098T.
Okay, so we have some questions on tax treaties. With tax treaties, again, it depends on your visa type, the income that you've received, the number of days you intend to spend in the US, and a whole host of other different factors. But again, Sprintax will take that into consideration once you're filling out the online questionnaire. And if you are due a tax treaty or you are eligible for one, we'll tell you, and you can then apply that to your tax return. So we'll certainly take that into consideration when you're filling out the online software.
So another one here, I arrived in the US on 31st of December 2018. I haven't filed tax for that one day as I was not aware back then. Kindly suggest what can be done. So yeah, even though it's only one day, because you arrived in the US in December 2018, you do need to submit something. So in your case, I assume, you know, if you're only there the one day, you probably haven't received income. So it'll just be the form 8843 that you need to complete, but definitely something that you should do. Even though it is only that one day, it is, you know, it's something that you really should do. So go and complete your form 8843 for 2018 just to bring everything up to date.
So there's a question for someone who has landed in 2021, do we have to file 8843? Next year you'll have to file it. We're only focused on the 2020 year right now. So we might do maybe 4 more questions. I think we have a lot of them covered anyway throughout the webinar. I know either myself or Elvira were answering questions there. So you might see what's left and see if we can kind of vary our responses.
Perfect. I have a question there. Can I not file Form 8843 online? Unfortunately not, no. If it's just the Form 8843 that you're completing, so if you haven't received any income and you're doing the Form 8843, that does need to be mailed, unfortunately. Once the option to e-file comes live, it'll be available for federal returns. Now, if you're completing a federal return, your Form 8843 is part of that. So everybody has that minimum requirement of Form 8843. But if it's Form 8843 on its own, it does need to be physically mailed to the IRS.
Great. There's a question here. I'm a graduate student working on campus. Am I considered part of OPT or CPT? So just, I suppose, the first part of that, I don't really know the answer to that, just because it's kind of, I suppose, out of our realm of tax. But I can answer your second part, which is I haven't gotten my social security number yet, but might have an ITIN provided by the university. Do I use that or get a new one? So if you haven't got a social security number, but you have an ITIN, use the ITIN, and that'll be sufficient. And then I'd probably reach out to probably the international office about your question on kind of OPT or CPT and being a graduate student. They'll be able to assist you with that.
Great, and a good question here as well. I am on F1 visa. I will be mailing my documents to the Department of Treasury. What documents do I need to send along with the federal filing copy generated on Sprintax? I have my W-2 form. Do I need to send my copy B of W-2? So have a look at the cover letter we provide at the end. So when you download your documents, that cover letter there is the first thing you'll see. So we outline everything that's needed there. So, it varies depending on your circumstances and your income sources and whatever, what you need to send along with the return. So have a look at that. It does give a checklist of what you need to send. So we'll have said in there exactly what it is you need to send. So be it the W-2 copy B or your 1042S, whatever the case may be, it will be outlined in that cover letter. So do have a read through that and follow the instructions there.
Okay, so what address do I provide if I'm currently outside the US? In that case, you can provide your address outside the US. We do ask you which one is the address that's applicable to you right now. However, for that situation, if you're due a refund, I would advise you not to, unless you're getting it directly into your bank account, I would advise you not to get a check sent overseas. And instead, if you don't have an active bank account, we do have an option online where we've partnered with a third-party provider, TransferWise, and they'll be able to facilitate the payment into your overseas account. But I'd be discouraging you to get an actual check sent overseas.
Great, and I have two questions then come true from the same person, so I'll cover both of these now. So do we need to fill in tourist visa information on Form 8843, and does Sprintax have Form 8843 from previous years? So yeah, absolutely. When we ask about your previous visits to the US in step one, we do need details of all previous visits, even on tourist visa, to correctly determine your residency for tax purposes. So it is important that you provide all of your previous visits, not just on your current visa, but on your previous visits, even tourist visas there as well. And does Sprintax have Form 8843 for previous years? Yes, absolutely. Sprintax can assist you with backfiling for those years that you may have missed. So do log on there. You can choose the year that you want to file and then just proceed on through the questionnaire and we'll prepare the relevant document for you.
Great. Thanks, Elvira. So it looks like we've covered the majority of questions. I know there's a couple of questions that were kind of worded in different ways, but I think most of the topics were covered today. If you have any questions while you're filling out the online Sprintax questionnaire, feel free to use the 24/7 live chat, and those guys will help you answer certain questions. Now, again, it's important to note that they won't be able to advise you on tax treaties or any specific information to you, because that's kind of the job of the software, and that's kind of where the logic is within. So once you're filling out the online questionnaire, the software will tell you if you've triggered a state filing requirement, or if you're due a refund back, or if you owe money, or if you need to file Form 1040NR, or if it's a different form. So once you filled out that online questionnaire, you'll get most of your answers. But other than that, thank you to everybody that joined, and we hope you found it helpful. We hope you found it answered all of your questions, and the very best of luck with your tax returns.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you both so much for presenting all this really helpful information. I know we all learned a ton from it. And for our students listening in today, we hope to see you at future OGS events. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Megan. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.